Welcome to our little short presentation, and then we'll have extended discussion. Obviously, it's August 23rd, 2020. So, a central and well-worn claim of believers, as at least the Abrahamic religions of which we're usually thinking of when we think about the traditional religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is that they claim that they own morality. Morality depends on their religion. Right and wrong exist, and they're certain of this, keep in mind, only because their deity exists. And this is so because right and wrong is whatever their deity says is right and wrong. This is what morality means to them, at least they say, and this is an essential part of their whole cosmic drama and their reason for being. They claim that people, Adam and Eve initially, but everyone else ever since, deliberately chose and continue to choose to do what they know is wrong. Depending on the flavor of theism, doing wrong includes things like having sex not intended to make babies or with the wrong gender people, divorce, eating the wrong things or the wrong combinations of things, and saying or even thinking blasphemy. But if you adopt their religion, believe their doctrines, and do what they say, more or less, sort of, then their deity will forgive you. And as Christopher Hitchens used to say, at the low price of the surrender of your critical faculties. I don't have to tell you that these ideas are absurd, offensive, and really immoral. I mean, for so many reasons. We've discussed a few of them over the years, but there's so many more. Perhaps the most grotesque evil of these ideas is that doing good, which should be its own reward, being good for goodness sake, as the child's rhyme goes, it's made into a shameful means of getting into heaven and escaping everlasting torture and agony in hell. That is, believers' morality is doing whatever you need to do to save your own skin. It is more than an immoral notion, it is an anti-moral idea. Two things bring this monstrous view of the matter crashing down, at least for those who pay attention and are unable or unwilling to adjust their so-called thinking to some, quote, higher and, quote, spiritual plane of incomprehensibility and, quote, mystery. One, of course, is that if Adam and Eve never existed, then there was no original sin and therefore no need of redemption. Hence the need to deny the facts of biology for serious believers. The other is if there is no immaterial, supernatural, quote unquote, soul that some inhabits and controls human bodies and, quote unquote, chooses to do or not to do things the way someone drives a car. Because if all we are, quote unquote, all we are is material, molecules in motion, then behaving according to physical laws, then there's no choosing of anything, at least in a traditional religious sense. There's nothing to do the choosing. The facts of biology, of life on this planet, are an astonishing and spellbinding story, what Richard Dawkins has called the greatest show on earth. Even what we know is only the barest outline, but we do know beyond any doubt there was no Adam and Eve. So there's no need to dwell on that except to say that the Genesis story, given a close reading, and if you haven't read it in a while, it's worthwhile just reading it through. It's short. It suggests not so much a story of crime and punishment, but of a coming of age, of a growing up, discovering this thing called human condition, and the need to come to grips with it. It suggests the earliest recognition of what the 19th century British philosopher John Stuart Mill recognized as an existential truth. And this is in his book, Utilitarianism. He was one of the early utilitarianists. It is indisputable that the being whose capacities of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of having them fully satisfied. And a highly endowed being will always feel that any happiness which he can look for, as the world is constituted, is imperfect. And he went on to say, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it's only because they only know their own side of the question. Mill, by the way, wrote a small book, which is really a delight to read on this subject we're talking about today. It's called Liberty. I don't know how many of you read it, but highly recommend it. So what of the second problem? Are we free to choose? do we have free will? If the power to choose requires this immaterial soul, then the answer is no. No such immaterial soul is needed to make sense of the operations of our bodies and brains. How could there even be a point of contact between such an immaterial entity and the material of which we are comprised? That's the question that Elizabeth, Princess Palatine of Bohemia, you probably never heard of her. She had correspondence with the great René Descartes, who famously said, I think, therefore I exist, or rather I exist, therefore I think, therefore I am. I got it wrong there. The great Cogito. He was also the one that advanced this mind-body dualism and claimed that there's a substance that interacted with the body. Well, Princess Elizabeth said, how could that be? If it's immaterial, how can it affect the material? Descartes lost that challenge. Neither he nor anyone since has been able to overcome that objection. But what of consciousness? Well, I think most of us know people like Deepak Chopra or New Agers. Even there's a physicist whose name I forget who's makes an argument that our senses are not tuned to show us what reality is, and that this would somehow support what some physicists say is that time and space is a artificial construct, does not really exist. But at any rate, they're all moves to try to save this idea of the soul. With quantum physics, with the spooky action at a distance or entanglement, and with emergent properties and other abstract and vague notions. Such efforts, of course, win awards from the Temple Foundation, which notoriously seeks to find ways to reconcile science with supernaturalism. None of it makes any sense, any more sense than Cartesian mind-body dualism. So what if we are nothing but materiality? What if our bodies and brains are simply molecules in motion doing what such things would be doing in any other circumstances, such as in, say, test tubes or even very sophisticated simulations? Our brains are brains in vats, aren't they? They're sitting in our skulls, wired up to our bodies and outside world. Brains are already carrying out the operations that if we were smart enough, we could build computing machines to mimic or simulate, right? Now, the famous 17th century German mathematician and philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz rejected materialism on this very ground. And he said it this way: and imagining that there is a machine whose construction would enable it to think, to sense, and have perception, one could conceive of it enlarged while retaining the same proportion, that one could enter into it, just like into a windmill. When you go into a windmill, you see how the inner workings are constructed and what it's doing. He says, suppose this, one should, when visiting within it, find only parts pushing one another and never anything to explain a perception. And I think that's true. Think about dissecting your brain with an electron microscope, atom by atom. You would never find anything like a mind. Nevertheless, there's never been the slightest shred of evidence or other reason to think that anything other than molecules in motion are needed to explain any operations or behaviors of living organisms, including human beings. Even the wonderful elements of apparent design in nature are revealed to arise as naturally as things like clouds, sand dunes, and complex crystals. We and other living things can be compared to Rube Goldberg machines. I don't know if any of you knew this. There's actually here's a postage stamp paying tribute to Rube Goldberg machines. These are these complicated little devices where one thing works against another. And this is basically how our body works. If you look at it at the biochemical level. And these are results of natural experiments over billions of years that amount to ways of solving various problems of survival and reproduction. But they're by no means always the best ways of solving such problems. And this is well demonstrated by all the many ways that we and other living things get sick and die. Of course, nowhere, and by the way, you're not meant to understand or be able to make this out. This is a biochemical pathways chart, and it's showing the resemblance to a Rube Goldberg machine. But nowhere in all of this is there any free will. Indeed, it's safe to say there's no room for free will in the realm of science. After all, how could we expect or theorize that a physical substance or molecule or collection of molecules, no matter how large or complex, could, quote, decide or, quote, choose to do something contrary to the regularities of physical laws that we have reliably always seen. Free will in that sense makes no sense. It is unscientific and irrational. Indeed, if it were ever that physical matter was deciding to act in arbitrary ways, contrary to what we know of the well-established regularities that had already been worked out through long experience, we would not be able to rely on anything. We would not know when an airplane might decide to remain aloft or when a medication might choose not to work. So does all this mean that we are not free, that we do not have free will? Is freedom an illusion? Well, I would say not necessarily. But it does mean that we need to revise our understanding of what we mean by these terms or what ideas they refer. We don't need to embrace supernaturalism and its absurdities to feel that we are autonomous beings relying on, among other things, moral principles to choose among a range of possible options when it comes to what we think, what we say, and what we do. For one thing, although consciousness cannot be observed objectively or scientifically, I think again about wandering about in Leibniz's enlarged brain, which is like a windmill, and only finding, pushing, or interacting with another. That does not mean that your consciousness does not exist. We do experience it after all. It is part of the qualia experience, qualia, of course, being the subjective, what it is like aspect of being ourselves. And we could just leave it at that and say that free will and choice and freedom is the experience of being able to act without coercion. But we can go further than this. For one thing, we are never really free from coercion of any kind. We must all deal with many necessities of life: how to make a living, how to get along with others, how to maintain our homes and cars, how to stay healthy, and if we get sick, what to do about it, to mention just a very few things. Of course, these are the problems that evolution has been spent billions of years trying to solve. Maybe not how to keep from losing your job, but certainly social position for social animals like us. And there are all other sorts of more subtle coercive forces, from the obvious ones placed upon us by government, everything from the need to renew our driver's licenses and pay taxes and so on, to less obvious social pressures to conform, and marketing messages that are carefully, often scientifically designed to get us to do things to advance the interests of others, possibly to our own detriment. Nevertheless, we're also aware of having options when it comes to all of these things. There are different ways that we may satisfy our needs. Life is like a gigantic game, except that not all of the rules and certainly not all of the goals are given to us. So consider by contrast a simple game of tic-tac-toe. Once you've played it a bit, one realizes that if one chooses properly, one can never lose. Against another player who also realizes this will always end in a draw. I don't know when was the last time any of you played tic-tac-toe. It's been a long time, I suspect, because when you know how the game works and you see that you can always get a draw, it's boring. The predictability of it is just not interesting anymore. But now consider chess. Here the possible moves are limited and stereotyped. You can only move the rook and the knight and so forth in certain ways. But the goal is clear as well, but the game is complicated enough that people who become interested in it never get to the point that, as tic-tac-toe, they realize that, I mean, for example, for all we know, it could be that the person making the opening move can always win. If our intellects were powerful enough, perhaps, and this is a real game, isn't it, that we're so limited, we would be able to look at a board game like this, have someone explain to us all the rules and the goal, and we would just realize, well, whoever makes the first move or whoever makes the second move, you know, you would realize something about it that makes it boring. Not boring, of course, because we are so limited. And this is also what makes it interesting to come up with computer programs that play chess and other games of comparable complexity like Go, which I think most of us hadn't heard about until we heard about artificial intelligence as being programmed to play it. Humans playing against these computers find them extremely challenging. Do such programs choose how to play? Well, in a way they do, because they've been taught the rules and they practice and they learn, and by the time they're playing the human players and the human players find it so challenging, we don't know how the computer is choosing to make its moves. They're not programmed to make the specific moves, so how can we say that they're not choosing? they're choosing in the same way that we choose, after all. How about when you drive a car somewhere? You get to where you're going and you almost are not aware of all the decisions you made along the way. But the computer that plays chess or Go does not experience choosing as we do. In the gigantic game of life, and actually, of course, there is this game of life, although when we've had game nights, these two games on the bottom tend to be more popular, the Terraforming Mars, and I think that's the Imperium 2030 is the right one. I'm sure, Mark. So here are the rules, and the point of the games are changing and to change. We've always before us a wide range of option in the actual game of life. We deal with it as we can, rely on our past experiences, what worked before, what didn't work before, the relevant facts as best we understand them, and on reasoning as best we can, and sometimes unreasoning as well, I should say, in deciding what options to pursue. But like many other games, things are too complicated to be able to see very far ahead. We can only do the best we can, and yet there's also in this a sense in which we do not choose or decide, because after all, we only do what we do after some deliberation. Again, looking at the facts, trying to reason it out. By the time we get through that, it may be pretty clear that there's only one option or one best option. So in what sense did we choose it? It may even be that we are so conflicted that we decide arbitrarily in some way. How many times has the toss of a coin determined something people have quote unquote chosen? Perhaps the most important element of free will is not that some supernatural soul chooses to contravene nature, or even that some knowledge, experience, and reasoning process brings us to make some choice that appears to be the best amongst the available. And in that sense, that choice is forced upon us. We experience, because we're participating in the deliberation, it feels like with this, it's called free will. Merlin first put me onto this some years back. Rules for Being Human, you can find on the internet. Actually, I think there's some versions that expanded out to 12 rules, and if you can read this, great. If you can, I'd just say a few. Number one, you will receive a body. May you like it or hate it, but be yours the entire period. Number two, you will learn lessons. You're in a full-time informal school called life. Each day in the school, you will have the opportunity to learn lessons. You may like the lessons or think them irrelevant and stupid. Number three, there are no mistakes, only lessons. Growth, the process of trial and error, experimentation. The failed experiments are as much a part of the process as the experiments that ultimately work. Number four, a lesson is repeated until learned. And it goes on from there. It's just kind of a little summation of what it's like going through life and how we have to make mistakes. And of course, if we can learn from the mistakes of others, all the better, but many times we can't. And when you get to number 10, your answers are inside you. The answers to those questions, all you need to do is look, listen, and trust yourself. And then some people add 11, you will forget all this. And number 12, you can remember it whenever you want. Well, the most important aspect of all may be just that it is our choice. For when our decisions are up to us, regardless of whether we made them after serious deliberation or without much thinking or even without any thinking, that we are responsible for the consequences. That can be a heavy burden when things don't turn out well. But it is also how we learn through trial and error, as the 10 rules or 12 rules show. And it's much more burdensome when decisions are made for us by others and things do not go well. That is when we feel freedom has been violated. And after all, in such situations, the others who made the decisions for us, they don't learn as we would, even if we had taken the very same decision. So again, I think free will is probably a little bit misformulated and should consider your will. Who does it belong to, not what is free, when we can't even really decide what free is. Because if there's a supernatural soul that is not acting according to rules and scientific laws as we know them, then it might as well be a coin toss. And in fact, that's really the kind of the situation with quantum physics as well. People say, well, quantum physics explains or describes how consciousness works, and how can that be? Because things are either determinist, or if they're indeterminate, they're completely random. so it doesn't solve the problem. None of these scientific concepts will ever solve the problem. It's always a qualia kind of sense of whose will it is. So just remember our principles of reason, enjoyment and appreciation, and achieving value, meaning, and purpose. And of course, you cannot go through life without having value, meaning, and purpose. Even the scientists have to decide what it is they want to study. They don't just toss a coin. Most of the time, they don't toss a coin as to what they're going to study, although I know of some interesting situations in which chance played a definite role. As we've said before, our principles are not any statements of dogma, and we can revise them anytime we want, and if we did within the last few months here, but we can always change them again, change it up, make it fun. Things that turn out the same every time, like tic-tac-toe, are boring. So we move on to our discussion, and just remembering what we've talked about last couple of times, that we should, when it comes to politics, focus mainly on public policy, that the parties and the personalities are just things over which we're never going to agree. State church and civil liberties are important. I think I did post to the NTCOF church Facebook page recently something about this interesting case that the Supreme Court has decided to accept, where Catholic Charities is challenging being excluded from state involvement in adoption because the Catholic Church will not consider gay couples to adopt. So the question is, will religious beliefs allowed to justify or make it legal for termination to happen? I think that'd be an absolute disaster because anybody can make up anything that is part of their so-called religious faith. Most of all, I think that even when it comes to Catholic Church, respecting others with whom we disagree, but focus on why we disagree. It should not be antagonistic. We should always for dispassionate and academic attitude, just like my statement earlier, that this idea that morality is to get into heaven, avoid hell, that it turns morality into a mere means to an end, and the end is become all important, more important morality. Let's talk about that. But where are the believers who are going to refute that? And then just quickly, August 23rd, in 1775, this date, King George III, this was his reaction to the Battle of Bunker Hill, proclamation of rebellion, that the colonies were in rebellion. And you may remember it wasn't even until a year later that the colonies said, oh, fine, we're just going to go it alone. 1784, I never knew this, Western North Carolina, which is now Eastern Tennessee, declared itself an independent state, calling itself Franklin. Wonder why they call themselves Franklin. Interesting. That independent state never was accepted into the Union. It lasted for about 4 years. In 1914, World War I, we forget Japan was involved in World War I. They were then colonizing, conquering a lot of Asia. They declared on Germany and joined our cause and harried their shipping and helped us in World War I. Afterwards, on the same date in 1919, during the discussion at the peace talks at the Treaty of Versailles, the Japanese proposed a racial equality proposal, which was opposed by our country and also by Australia. And because it was defeated, the Japanese turned more to nationalism and militarism. And maybe that led to World War II on the Japanese side, just like the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles led to World War II on the German side. In 1954, the first flight of the Lockheed C-130 was carried out on this date. In 1991, on this date, the World Wide Web was opened. And today is the International Day for Remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition. I have not seen any news today, and I'll be interested in the discussion or if anybody has heard about this, because, gosh, with all the things in the news about quote-unquote racism and all of this sort of thing, you would think that an international day, the remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition, would be in the news or actually noted and honored, if not celebrated. So please, I hope that's enough to think about for at least a week, and I hope not longer than that. These are very interesting questions, I find. And remember too that Freethought is not free. I greatly appreciate the contributions that you all continue to make. You know who you are. They are tax deductible, of course, and I still haven't gotten around to finding a little picture or maybe take a picture. I don't have those rainbow boxes. I've got to talk to Edwin. Either he or John Henderson, John Hendricks rather, has got that. And of course, obviously, the reasons to give us your money, doing together what none of us can do on our own. And of course, if you don't really care about morality and doing the right thing, and you just look at it as a means to an end, then by golly, you don't want to get sent to heck. Help us promote your values, demonstrate your commitment, and be the future that you wish to see. It's up to all of us to change the world. We can't all do it alone, and we can only do it a little bit at a time, but it's got to happen, and there's a way to happen. So with that, we can move on to Q&A discussion.